Hello, everyone. Since we still have a lot to go over for Chapter 8, I decided to go ahead and make a video lecture uh, so that you'll have the opportunity to hear everything because unfortunately, I will not be able to get through everything in class on Monday. So, with that being said, I'm going to go ahead and move forward. At this point, we had left off where we were going to be discussing and talking about representativeness and heuristic as well as base rate information. So, when we're talking about representativeness heuristic, we're looking at the assumption about an item that might look like or resemble members of a category, which probably would fall in line within that category. That this type of heuristic thinking is pretty much really helpful and correct, but not necessarily going to be helpful in terms of dealing with uncommon categories. So, one thing you can see it as is a strategy for being able to make categorical judgments in which a given person or target may base how closely the exemplar matches the typical or average member of a category. With that being said, we can look at an example in terms of how we might be given a choice of two categories, like a poet and an accountant, in terms of people, and the likelihood to be assigned to a person who would be considered unconventional, like a person wearing clothing that's, casual, chill, compared to a person wearing business attire. Um, or someone that's reading a poetry book into which the former category. However, the much greater frequency of accountants within the population would mean that a person like this would more than likely be an accountant if they dress business wise, right? So this where we're talking about representativeness heuristic would be actually more like a form of base rate fallacy. And now base rate fallacy, we're looking at base rate information in which the data about the common is some category would be placed in. What does this even mean? It's a decision-making error in which information about the rate of the occurrence uh, of some trait in a particular population really would be ignored, or it's not going to be given the appropriate weight for its worth. An example of this would be looking at two categories of a person, of people, excuse me, that may categorize a man as an engineer rather than being a lawyer if they heard that he actually liked physics and mathematics in school. Whereas even if they knew that he was within a population that consists of 90% of lawyers and 10% of engineers, they still would probably go more in line with the engineers, even though he could be a lawyer that just like physics. Hopefully that makes a little bit of sense. However, just remember, people tend to overlook the base rate information when they're making assumptions. That's why it's really important to try not to make assumptions because it's that error. You heard of the term never assume. I won't break it down, but you understand where it now comes from. So availability heuristic is a common strategy in which we're making judgments about the likelihood of a particular occurrence in which an individual may base their judgments, on the importance of the information that's going to be held within their memory, specifically about a particular type of event. And more available and relevant information would be there, and the likelihood there would then be that we now have something actually to be able to judge. So, using this type of strategy actually leads to error in judgment when the information that is highly available in our memory, like well publicized events or something tragic like a plane crash, God forbid. But these are things that would pop out within your head, and it would lead people more or less to believe that those kind of events are more probable than they actually are. Um, and then because of that, when the relative, excuse me, when that relative unavailability of information, like if it's less publicized um, because it had disastrous turnouts like death, um, then this would lead people to believe that these types of situations really would be less probable than they actually are. So an example of that is we talked about a plane crash and the probability being low, whereas mortality rates for someone with type 2 diabetes would be more common and more higher. So, but we would think less on that. So it more or less see it as a tendency to make errors that we consider to be that availability bias. So in other words, looking at this slide, see we're saying estimating how common something would be, and we tend to think of examples in which we can actually gather information from our minds, stuff we recall, and those uncommon events, which are more memorable, can actually distort how we think about things, and we'll make assumptions because of it. So now we're going to just take a look at by comparing the two as far as representativeness heuristic and availability heuristics. Just see it as the tendency to, when we're making those assumptions, with the representative heuristic, we're taking a particular item or situation that would resemble a particular category that probably would belong within that category. Whereas availability heuristic, we're more easily going to think about members of that particular category being because it's a more common category to think about in the first place. We're led astray because of the resemblance of members of a rare category, making us think that it should be part of the scheme. And in availability heuristics, we can get an error in terms of one category gets more publicity than the other, so therefore it's more memorable, even though it might not be more realistic. And you have the elections going on, and you have seen and heard many different things that are factual and unfactual, but if you recall the unfactual information more, you may wind up leading with thinking that that's what should be in place. All right, so let's talk about being overconfident or overconfidence. In this area, it's all about how our cognitions develop and how we utilize it. And for some of us, we feel like, we have it going on and we can hash out and think about things clearly, and therefore it kind of gives us that upcheck of saying we know it all. Well, one, let's talk about critical thinking. This is where there's a careful evaluation of what's evidence, like evidence based, things that we know is factual, um, that we can argue against any kind of conclusion and say what it is because we have evidence to prove such. A lot of times people, though, tend to overestimate their knowledge that's required for any kind of task, particularly when we're watching someone else do it. We pick up on it, like whatever the current dance is, you watch somebody, you learned it, you feel you now do it better. Okay? This can actually be helpful in terms of just being able to get yourself out there, being striving to want to achieve these different things. Like if we say the examples here on the slide, it's talking about how we might push ourselves for a new job, going after that a promotion, winning an election. Yeah, you're going to keep hearing that one, y'all, because guess what? I hope y'all are ready to vote because we'll be voting in a week. All right, anyway, when we're talking about critical thinking, this is one of the facets that we try to enhance in terms of your abilities and your aptitude here at Jackson State. Your curriculum is infused with critical thinking skills. We want you to be able to leave here and be able to problem solve and make decisions effectively and efficiently. Some things you got to understand, though, it can be harmful when we make hasty or costly mistakes. An example about this would be if we talked about how investors lost money, or when we talk about students failing the test because you failed to study enough, or you relied on an open book test. Yes, I'm gonna rub that in on y'all a little bit too, but that's okay. In essence, you can still make it if you inspire to achieve. And that's meaning you're utilizing your critical thinking skills to get yourself to that point, trying to solve the issue in the best ways possible. All right, so we have a couple of other cognitive errors that I want to go over briefly. One would be confirmation bias, and that's where we're seeking evidence to support a favorite hypothesis instead of considering any other kind of possibilities that might be out there. So an example of this would probably be looking at presidential elections in which people tend to see the information, they're looking for information that would actually paint their candidate that they want to support in a positive light, while dismissing any information that would make it negative. Prime example, our former president. Those who are wanting and considering to uh, vote for him again, they are ignoring the fact that he's been a convicted criminal. And he is making history by being the first convicted criminal that has 34 counts, by the way, to actually be running for the president of the United States. So if that ain't trying to be gangster, I don't know what is. Anyway, that would be confirmation bias. People are just trying to ignore the obvious. Now, when we're talking about functional fixedness, here we're looking at a cognitive bias in which, more or less, it limits how people can use objects in various ways. Now, an example in this term would be how one spouse might see making dinner as a defining characteristic for the other spouse, while the other spouse might see this task as making dinner as the job of whoever is in the house, period. Like, where I was trying to be genderless, but let's throw gender in there, where a husband feels it's the wife's job. And then demographically, we're here in the South, I find that a lot of men feel that the women should be still cooking in the kitchen, whereas a woman who has a job as well figures whoever gets home first should be making dinner for everybody. That would be the example of functional fixedness. Now, talking about that, we then have to look at framing. So when we're framing, more or less we're defining the context of issues or issues that surrounding a particular question or a problem or a situation in which there's ways that might serve to influence how that context or those issues can be perceived or evaluated. This is what we also call that framing effect. So now, an example of framing effect would be, you know how you go to the supermarket and you're going to get some ground beef and you might choose the ground beef because it says 85% lean beef in comparison to finding one that says it's 15% more fatty. And you choose the one that says lean instead of fatty because you're being health conscious. However, either way it's been stated, that's really the same type of beef. It's just that it gave you something different and it's worded differently that made it more persuasive to you. So that would be the framing effect. Now, when we're talking about sunk cost effect, we're falling into a category that's dealing a lot with behavioral economics in terms of an interdisciplinary field that would be concerned about how we would understand heuristics as well as biases and other psychological variables that can influence the economy of our behavior, how we go about dishing out our actions, so to speak. So, in contrast, you have to look at the standard view in terms of traditional economics, where people are having rational actors of how they would put their money, right? How they're going to keep their money, what they're going to use their money for. You can use this the same way in terms of making rational choices that's going to help to maximize your well-being. And more or less, when we're talking about behavioral economics, we're looking at human rationality as well as the limitations that we might be subjected to that occurs within our personal, our social, as well as our situational influences. So that's what the sunken cost effect would be. More or less just a willingness for us to do something because of money or an effort that it's already been spent, so we can act on that anyway. So, okay, there we have it, and let's move on. Okay, so I'm going to move a little quickly. I'm sure you kind of have a good understanding about conspiracy thinking, but just remember those who believe in conspiracy theories, a lot of times there's more than one that they believe in. If they have one, they have 20 more behind that. Unfortunately, these individuals tend to be less educated. They have a lot of anxiety. They'll be dealing with low self-esteem and vulnerable in terms of being gullible. They take in and believe everything. A lot of times they wouldn't feel in control. They always feel like they're being persecuted, prosecuted, being attacked, and that makes these conspiracies feel even more real to them. Just defining experts. Expertise is pretty much where a person is able to solve problems quickly with minimum error due to the practice, the study, and the learning of particular topics and subjects. So individuals that fall in this category, they'll start doing well with something, and more than likely, they start to devote a lot of time to it so that they can become extremely good at it. This way, they're allowed to be able to provide quick feedback, they're able to demonstrate and show practice, and pretty much show someone how to improve themselves in the area. When we're talking about experts, you have to look at the different patterns and recognize some of the features, and you have to be able to do it quickly. Like, for example, me teaching Introduction to Psychology. I've been doing this for so many years that I'm able to, for the most part, answer many questions that you might have without having to open my textbook because I studied it enough and read it enough and practiced it enough that I can kind of go through it verbatim. Okay, let's talk about near transfer and far transfer. Near transfer, more or less, is things that's between very similar but not exactly identical contexts, whereas far transfer would be context that's more on appearance, that's more remote or alien to the other. So these are techniques that would be used in applying learning to for different situations that more than likely would be dissimilar to the original learning concept. So breaking that down, making it similar, just follow what it says on the slide in terms of it being assumed that practicing one skill can help in terms of the refinement of another similar or dissimilar skill. Near transfer, again, would benefit a skill from practicing a similar skill, where far transfer would benefit a skill from practicing something that's not even related to it. All right, so we are now moving into language itself. And when we're talking about language, just some terms that I want you to be familiar with in helping you understand what we look at in psychology in terms of language. First would be productivity. That's looking at the ability for how we combine our words and create new sentences. Then you have transformational grammar. This is being able to take deep structure of a sentence and make it more surface. And when I say surface, that surface is coming up with the construct of that original sentence in the first place. So the deep structure within transformational grammar would be that underlying meaning of the sentence, but the surface is showing you the words that's put into place to come to that meaning. Okay. So how many of y'all have pets and y'all have conversations with your pets like they speak English to you? I think I've mentioned my pet, and I'm not going to say his name because he's in the room with me, and if I say his name, he's going to wake up and start barking. So we won't do that. But I do have conversations with him, and hence that's why I won't say his name, because he'll recognize it and then want to have a conversation and then become involved. However, there's several different species in which you'll see they have the ability to learn and utilize language. Specifically, we talk about chimpanzees and how they're able to respond to the basic verbal as well as physical communication. Here, they learn sign language, and it's some of the best results came from experiments done with the bonobos and how they were able to learn to use the keyboard to create short sentences and communicate with us in that aspect, in that way. Now, in regards to when we're talking about language and intelligence, let's first start by saying that intelligence without language or language without intelligence really can't go. They're both hand in hand. You need one for the other, okay? In talking about any kind of disorders or syndromes, let's first look at Williams syndrome. And here, this is an autosomal dominant disorder that's rare, number one. And what it is caused by the deletion of segments that's within the chromosome. And the specific chromosome is number 7. Additionally, what's present is symptoms of mild to moderate intellectual developmental disorder, and would be characterized by the person having difficulties thriving, and biologically they would have high concentrations of calcium in their bloodstream. Their blood vessels would be narrowing, specifically the aorta. There'll be a restriction of blood flow going to the heart. So this is really not only in terms of just language, but it's really debilitating for them, their cardiovascular. So they also will present with unusual facial features, like they may have a short nose with a broader tip. Their mouth might be wide and demonstrate with a smaller chin. And people with Williams syndrome, more than likely, they're going to be highly sociable, but their ability to perform visual spatial tasks would be impaired. Verbal skills, actually, though, is quite superior. Now, in a lot of cases, they're not inherited, but actually they're random in terms of the development of the reproductive cells within the eggs or the sperm, and it would be in a parent of an affected person. Now, let's talk about language acquisition and the language acquisition device. We're talking about a hypothetical aptitude that actually it helps to explain when a child's ability to how they go about acquiring language. So this was proposed by Benjamin Whorf, and what he felt was that LAD, L-A-D, is actually an inherited mechanism that allows us or allows children to develop language structure pretty much from the linguistic data that's supplied by the caregivers or their parents. Now, if you don't remember or haven't heard of him, Noam Chomsky also worked in the area of language, and he pretty much reinterpreted language acquisition device. However, LAD in his case contains significant innate knowledge that actively interprets the input, but only this can be explained by a highly abstract level of competence within the language results, and then because of that, it's relatively a deprived input. Just to help you to get a further understanding, we can discuss this in terms of looking at how deaf children who haven't been taught sign language actually come up with their own means of communication. Like they doing hand signals, they might be able to learn how to read lips and so forth. So now it's time to look at the brain and language. Our ability to be able to learn language is evolutionary in terms of how we adapt, like our breath control, how we are able to dispose and imitate, our ability to learn as well as remember vocal patterns, being able to enhance those different areas of our brain, and controlling how we work and use the larynx. Now, there's two forms of aphasias that demonstrates impairment. When there's impairments, it's going to impact and affect our speech and language. Broca's aphasia causes damage to our frontal cortex, and this is going to result in us having problems with producing language. Whereas the Wernicke's aphasia, here we're talking about how it's causing damage to our temporal cortex. And what happens there is there's an impairment where we have difficulties being able to recognize and recall nouns, as well as being able to understand language itself, even though we might have fluent and grammatical speech in place. Here are some stages of development where an infant in terms of 3 months, they're making noise, they're starting to do sounds, they're starting to learn vowels, and I think we don't have any recent research on the area, but I don't know if you look at TikTok and look at the reels that's like on other social media pages like Facebook and such, and you might find where parents are talking to their infants that's 2 to 3 months old. There's one that they're specifically saying, "I love you," and they're repeated, and they'll go, "I love you." If I find it, I'm going to post it with this. Try to put this in there with that. Get permission to anyway, so that you can see this. But at 6 months, they move from making vocalizations to actually babbling. They start with their own communication style and having their own language. But as they get older, that babbling will start having more verbiage that's of our language, English or Spanish or whatever within the culture they're brought up in. And probably it's going to be more to the words of like being able to say mama, and language comprehension is going to get improved by leaps and bounds as the months move on. So, like at 1.5 years, they start saying about some words in terms of they'll learn about 50 vocabulary words, mostly going to be nouns. However, phases like I love you that won't run as often, but it can be present. Approximately 2 years of age, that's when you'll start seeing them use two-word phrases. However, again, I want to say that we haven't had enough research to show that this is actually changing because I've seen 2-year-olds have full-fledged conversations where they have complete sentence structure. So I think this is something that's now happened to be updated actually. But at 2.5, as far as for your knowledge base in for this course, you'll stick with what the textbook has. So 2.5 years, they're starting to demonstrate longer phrases. They're using and utilizing short sentence, and they may have some errors here and there, but you still start to understand more of what they're trying to express. At 3 years, now their vocabulary has grown to at least 1,000 words approximately, and they're able to start using those longer sentences with fewer errors. And then finally, just at this point, in terms of development at 4 years old, their speech is almost that of an adult. So they're now able to communicate effectively with adults.
Okay, can you say I love you? I love you. It's not funny. I do. I love you. I love you. Yeah, go ahead. See your lips move. Try it. Say it. Yeah, good boy. Yeah, my baby. Oh, you get.
What we've discovered in terms of when I'm talking about no language or two language is the introduction or the lack thereof is extremely influential for a child in terms of their exposure. If they've never been exposed to language in early on during infancy and when they were a toddler, then they will have permanent impairments as far as trying to learn one. Whereas when we're talking about bilingualism, we're talking about the use of two languages. People who learn two languages during infancy actually shows activity on both sides of their brain, the left and the right hemispheres are working overtime in terms of being able to speak both languages. And these individuals, particularly after age 6, they'll use more or less just one hemisphere at that point to speak both languages. So they're able to latch onto it and they're able to adapt actually quickly with it. So how we go about understanding and comprehending language pretty much comes with how we experience life actually. To understand a particular word, you have to imagine the experience to which it refers. So during class on Friday, we used the term racket. And you remember racket, we had two meanings for it. Racket being the object itself that we would use in tennis, or racket in terms of the extreme noise levels that might be surrounding us at a particular time. We have to know what context to be able to use it, as we mentioned. So we work toward understanding ambiguous words and sentences in context by taking what we've learned through experience and knowledge about our worldviews in general. All right, so now let's talk about how we throw in clauses and those negatives. A lot of our sentence structure, it can be actually difficult for you to understand because there'll be these embedded clauses, or we might be speaking negatively. So embedded clauses really is a burden or overburden in terms of It throws a muck to our memories in terms of trying to understand a meaning behind something. Like I said, we take the one word racket and you have two different meanings. If you haven't been a person who plays tennis or watch tennis, you might not realize that a racket can actually have that meaning, and a person could be talking to you about tennis rackets and you have no clue. That's where we're embedding these clauses and trying to assume that everybody has that same memory, which we do not. Now, when we add a negative to a sentence, what happens sometimes is that sentence might then get thrown totally into a negative connotation, even if you didn't want it to happen that way. Hence, it's considered a double negative because it's distorting the intention of the sentence in the first place. You might say something negative, but wanting to have a positive outlook to it, but the person's going to still perceive it as a negative situation. So now let's break down how we go about reading language. So we're talking about reading and word recognition. A phenom is that unit of a sound such as sh or s. Then we have morphemes, and that's a unit of meaning that allows us to break down the meaning of individual words. You then understand this is something that we do our whole life. We start early and keep learning how to read. And because of this, the more you practice at it, the more of an expert you become at reading, where you're going to start recognizing letters and common words instantaneously, even if they're twisted upside down. You're able to see a word. Do you ever notice on social media they may have those type of little puzzles in which there'll be a saying and they replace the letters with numbers, but you still understand and know what the word is supposed to be? That's what we're talking about here. You've become such an expert at reading that even when they have it mixed up somewhat, because you've practiced enough, you're able to still recognize it and read it. Okay? So, hence we're talking about word superiority effect, which would identify a letter or more accurately a part of a word when it's presented by itself. You're going to see it and know it. Brief understanding about reading and eye movements. So, when we read, we have to use our eyes. And for some, people got to go back and forth. They got to actually move their head with it when they're reading from left to right. Some don't have to move their heads, but their eyes are still going back and forth. Now, there are those with fixations in which our eyes will stay stationary. And then there's what we have as saccades, and that's that quick eye movement where the one fixation will point to another. You're going back and forth like I mentioned. Fixations, though, understand they are considered to be longer on uncommon words and words that will have more than one meaning. That's where we're going to kind of try to beam in and learn it and figure it out by not just doing a quick look, but you're going to kind of try to study it. All right, so here's a knowledge check that I want you to try to guess and answer. No, you don't have to worry about this being in your assignments, but this is something for you to know. How many phonemes and morphemes would be in the word truthfully? The word again is truthfully. So how many phonemes and morphemes do you see here? All right, so there are 8 phonemes: TR, U, TH, F, ULLY, truthfully, which has 3 morphemes, truthfully. Wrap this up. Here's a summary about Chapter 8. hopefully you recall and remember what we discussed in terms of attentive and pre-attentive processing. You're able now, you should be able to provide examples for a phenomenon that's related to attention, like what is change blindness. I'm hoping that at this point you now know what attention deficit disorder is. We talked a lot about categorization and the effects it has on thinking. You should now know the differences between type 1 and type 2 processing, as well as explain the different advantages and disadvantages we might see when we're talking about maximizing and satisficing. During this particular video lecture, I discussed the common errors when we're talking about cognition and thinking. We looked at factors that help us in understanding the belief about conspiracy theories. I talked to you about the basis of development in terms of how we go about becoming an expert and what we do as experts or to help make other experts. We also looked at and discussed the attempts of how we go about teaching language to chimpanzees and how they are actually able to, like for example, we talked about how they're able to type out short sentences on the keyboard. We also looked at how to go about evaluating some of the explanations that's used and how we specialize in the ability to learn how to develop our language. Last but not least, we are able to now hopefully distinguish the types of language as well as the different impairments involved within our brain structure. You should now know how children go about developing language, and do rewind this if you're not sure. Go back, listen, and what you don't know, ask questions to. Last but not least, again, it's explaining the role of eye movements in terms of how we go about reading and being able to recognize words. So, this is our last chapter for the semester, people. We are done. We are finished with chapter 8. For the rest of this week now, on Wednesday and Friday, you will be working in class on one or two things. I'm going to allow y'all to work on either your group presentations or your written papers, because those are the two things that's coming up for you. Also, bring your questions. On Wednesday, again, make sure you have something for you to do. We won't be talking about anything in terms of review. I might hold it, like I said, a practice exam prior to your final, but if there's questions you have throughout the semester, things that you've read in your textbook, bring them during this time. Group 1, for group presentations, you're going to be the first group to present on November 4th. That's going to be the following Monday. Now, what I need for you to do, and your assignment is already open for you, you will need to make sure you upload your PowerPoint slides as well as record your PowerPoint as a video and save it as an MP4 and upload that into your assignment. So in doing that, if there's any difficulties, you let me know and I'll help you with that. I'm going to try to make an example of my video lecture, using that to show you how to go about recording as well as how you go about uploading it. Well, it's all you have to do is click submit and it'll let you upload your stuff. So, with that being said, we are done with the textbook. I thank you for listening, and I will send out more information as time marches on. Talk to you soon.